We ended class today with the clean shaven John Brown bringing his own brand of justice or crazy justice to hack five allegedly pro slavery people to death after the sack of Lawrence, which was a free soil town that was basically run over by border ruffians. Now, the next time we're going to see him, he's got a huge, that's actually what we call a Van Dyke, but quite bushy. That's just 3 years later, after he's basically been traveling around trying to raise money to foment this slave insurrection, this slave rebellion. And we'll talk about it a little more later. But in 1859, the major problem with his logic was the slaves didn't quite know he was coming. And as a result, he's easily captured and ends up being far more important in death than he is in life. But we want to go to the end of 1856 to sort of a sneaky, underrated election. Now, what's important about this particular election is that it's the first time that the Republicans are running a presidential candidate. The party's only 2 years old. And John C. Fremont is actually quite imbalanced. He's a hero of the Mexican American War. James Buchanan is a Northerner who's running as a Democrat. And again, we saw before him Franklin Pierce, who was also a Northerner. And so it's really interesting, sort of pro slavery Northerners. But what's also important about James Buchanan is he wasn't involved in the Kansas Nebraska Act. He was actually off in Europe at the time. So it's sort of easy to say, well, he wasn't involved. But what's also important for us to understand is the Southerners basically said, if you country elect a Republican, we're out. So they sort of made the threat in 1856 that they're also going to make in 1860. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected, and we see that threat come to fruition. There's also a third party candidate there, Millard Fillmore, who'd actually been the president once Zachary Taylor died. He'd sort of been a Whig then, and now he's going to run as a know-nothing. Doesn't have the greatest impact overall in the election, but it's sort of an interesting side note that a former president is now running as a third-party candidate. We're going to see that with Teddy Roosevelt as well in 1912. Now, 1857 is the first year of what we call Old Buck, or Buchanan's presidency. And actually, Old Buck was a very, very impressive pedigree prior to the presidency, but he is going to go down as the worst, or if not the second worst president in U.S. history, in part because the country comes apart under him and he sort of, quote, fiddles while Rome burns. He sort of does nothing. But he's got to deal with the Dred Scott decision, which is really out of his control. The Panic of 1857, which your book doesn't even mention, which is shocking to me, which is really out of his control. And the Lecompton Constitution, which really is a congressional matter as well. So it's all out of his control, but he's going to be the president while it all goes down. So let's talk about the Dred Scott case. And I know that we already had our quiz on it, and I know that there were a considerable part of the reading questions on it. But the idea of Dred Scott is that Dred Scott had gone with his master into free territory, into Illinois and Wisconsin, by virtue of the Northwest Ordinance, as well as the Missouri Compromise. This is free land. And so when he was taken back to Missouri, he sued under the doctrine of once free, always free. Roger Brooke Taney, who actually some of you may remember as the guy that actually helped liquidate the funds from BOTUS back under Andrew Jackson when Duane wouldn't do it, Roger Brooke Taney would. Well, he's going to be the Chief Justice after Marshall. And again, Marshall is, super federalist, super strong central government, pro-business. Roger Brooke Taney is the other. He's very much a states' rights Southern guy. And the first claim he makes is that, listen, Dred Scott, you're a slave. A slave cannot bring a suit in a federal court because you're not a citizen. So at the end of the day, he could have stopped there, but RBT goes further. He says slaves are property, and that's what he defines it as. And the Fifth Amendment basically says that Congress cannot take property without due process of law, which basically means you just can't take it from somebody unless you go through the full legal process. Now, technically, there's something in the Fifth Amendment called eminent domain, which means you can take property with just compensation, but I'm not going to go into that. And so as a result of the fact that slaves are property and you can't take property from someone, ergo, Taney says, Congress actually had no authority at any time to pass a law depriving someone of having their property. So he's basically saying the Missouri Compromise, passed in 1820, engineered by the great compromiser Henry Clay, was unconstitutional then and was always unconstitutional for its 34 years of existence. Now, at the end of the day, the Kansas-Nebraska Act the Kansas-Nebraska Act got rid of the Missouri Compromise 3 years earlier, so it doesn't really matter. But when the Supreme Court rules on something, it's different than when Congress repeals it or creates a new law. Basically means it can't come back, which is a really, really big deal. Now, when we think about the South and the North and, who's getting what during this era, the South has been throwing itself quite a pity party up until now. Remember, the Fugitive Slave Law, which is the only part of the Compromise of 1850 that they got, is not being adhered to by the North. It's, in fact, being openly flaunted when they seem to get, the chance for slavery and popular sovereignty in Kansas. It's like it's being fought viciously over. But this is enormous. This is like the greatest win that they got. And then the North basically looks at it and says, that doesn't count. It's sort of the way that Jackson looked at the Worcester v. Georgia case, just like dismissed it. So the North's like, well, that's really great, RBT, but we're not really even going to consider it valid. And so the South's like, are you kidding me? Like, we get something and you just completely ignore it. So remember, as we look at the fabric of this nation coming apart, this is a very big deal. Now, the Panic of 1857 certainly follows the Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837. It's about a 20-year cycle. And we want to think about this, okay? There's always some sort of overlying sort of macroeconomic issue. So this, believe it or not, has to do with like America providing grains for the Crimean War that's going on in Europe. And then at the end of every war, there's sort of less of a demand. We see that in our own wars. And as a result of California gold coming out, 1849, there's inflation. As always, there's over speculation. And then there's the uncertainty regarding slavery. Anytime that there's uncertainty, it affects the market. When we even saw that with the election just now. So at the end of the day, it's not really the issue of what causes the panic, but it's really what are the effects. Now, the northern businesses look at this, and there'd been a Democratic tariff of 1857. Now, again, the Democrats are in control, and it has basically dropped tariff rates. Okay, remember the Democrats drop tariff rates. Whigs and Republicans like to increase tariff rates. And they go, you know what? This is really bad for business. Clearly, when we get in power, which they will, we're going to raise tariffs. Now, nobody did terribly well in the Panic of 1857 and its aftermath, but the South did better than the North. So both are agricultural, in many ways. There's grain in the North and cotton in the South, but the cotton prices don't fall as much. And so the Southerners look at this and they say, we knew it the whole time. Cotton is king. Nothing else can compare. If everything else died, cotton would still be standing. And so it's confirmation for them what they've been saying the whole time. Like, our system, which you guys consistently attack, is better and is better for this country. Look at you with your, wage slaves in the North. You know what? You're hurt by the Panic of 1857 way more than we are. So in many ways, it adds to sort of their superiority, inferiority complex. Like, they feel that they're superior and they feel like they're being crapped on. And they're like, well, why is this all the time that no one seems to like us? Okay. Now, the Lecompton Constitution gets confused with, the Wilmot Proviso, the Gadsden Purchase, the Crittenden Compromise. They all sort of are weird words that have like a name and then a noun. The Lecompton Constitution is confusing. I will admit that. But basically what it was is the pro-slavery people in Kansas. Remember, there are like two governments that get set up in Kansas, one that's pro-slavery, one that's free soil. The pro-slavery people come up with a constitution. And again, you need a constitution in order to become a state, and they want to become a slave state. So it basically says slaves are legal here if you vote yes. And if you vote no, all the slaves that are already here get to stay. So it's like slavery or slavery asterisk. No matter what, it's pro-slavery. And the free soilers are so pissed off by what they see as just like a ridiculous constitution. They don't even vote. So of course it passes. And then it gets sent to Congress, who actually has to verify it, has to agree to it, and then become a state. Well, Stephen Douglas, again, Mr. Popular Sovereignty, of course, at this point, he's still an Illinois senator. He hasn't had that, famous election against Lincoln in 1858, but he's an Illinois senator. He looks at this and goes, no. I can't support this. Like, this is not true popular sovereignty. This was like slavery or slavery asterisk. It wasn't slavery or no slavery. So he uses his power, just as he used power in, 1854 to get the Kansas-Nebraska, to reject it. Now, that's really, really important because this is sort of strike one against Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas wants to be president of the United States. And in order to be president, he really needs support from North and South in terms of the Democrats. But this is just like him sending a message. It's like he's more popular sovereignty than he is like actually getting Kansas as a slave state. So they're looking at him as like a real sellout. That's strike one. You're going to see strike two in just a second. Okay. So strike two comes in the election between Lincoln and Douglas, which is a sort of a funny election because Lincoln is so tall and Douglas is so small, even though his name was the Little Giant. And again, they're running for Senate in Illinois. This is not for president. They'll run against each other 2 years later. Lincoln is a Republican. Last time we saw Lincoln, he was a Whig congressman calling out, where's the spot that Mexican-American war started? Now he's had like almost 20, no, I take that back. He's had about 13 years to sort of like rehabilitate his image. And, the Republican Party's given him a new shot. Douglas is Mr. Powerful in the Senate. And so they have a number of debates. And the second one is way up north in Illinois, sort of out towards Galena, and it's in Freeport. Now, they basically had the same sort of debates everywhere they went, which is sort of interesting. It was just for like different people to get to hear them. And Lincoln knows what he's going to do, and Douglas knows what Lincoln's going to do. It's no surprise. But Lincoln tries to trap Douglas by basically saying, listen, are you still Mr. Popular Sovereignty, even though Dred Scott decision has effectively said that popular sovereignty doesn't work? Remember, Dred Scott had said that Congress may make no laws about property, namely slavery, in the territories, which means that popular sovereignty doesn't work, because popular sovereignty gives a 50-50 chance that there will be slavery or won't be slavery. So he basically says, what are you for? Your idea of popular sovereignty, or for basically what the Supreme Court said? And wouldn't you think that the Supreme Court is right because you're a Democrat and seem to support Democrats? Well, in the end, Douglas is like, duh, I'm Mr. Popular Sovereignty. He's like, despite the court's ruling, slavery could, in fact, still be, agreed to or rejected, just sort of depending on the laws that are made there. Like, Foner says, like, they could make laws that sort of are more explicitly protecting it or not. He's basically like, you know what? It didn't kill popular sovereignty. And the Southern Republicans are like, what are you doing? Why are you still trying to push popular sovereignty when we've got this amazing gift in the Dred Scott decision? So that's strike two. So strike one was that he wouldn't accept Kansas's slave state application with the Lecompton Constitution. Second is it just keeps pushing pops off over just this real benefit of Dred Scott. But he still wins the election in Illinois. And in the process of winning the election, he sort of is going to lose the presidency 2 years later. Lincoln, who loses the election, does really, really well for himself and puts himself in a position to be the Republican nominee 2 years later in 1860. Now, here's a picture of John Brown with that sort of amazing full beard. The picture I showed you, he only had what's known as a Van Dyke, but you could just see how hirsute he is from Kansas all the way up to Harper's Ferry. Now, what's interesting here about the last moments of John Brown, which is a painting of him being led to the gallows, is that John Brown, his plan was terrible. It was terrible in theory. It was terrible in execution, trying to basically take weapons to give to slaves, to lead a rebellion. But when he's caught, he acts with such sort of dignity that he doesn't look like a crazy person, which he was. And many Northerners are like, wow, this is a great man who's really being persecuted by the South. The South is like, this is anything but a great man. This man is trying to foment rebellion. He's trying to take our property away from us. He's literally the boogeyman. Now, this image is famous for many reasons, in part because you'll see, this African-American woman with her baby sort of kissing him as he goes, sort of like almost like thank you. But you'll also notice that John Brown, who is white, there is no doubt that he is white, is painted to look perhaps darker, perhaps black. And it's a really sort of interesting portrayal of John Brown, the ambiguity of his race as he's being led to the gallows. But again, this is the worst nightmare for the South. They've worried ever since 1831, really, with the Liberator coming out and then Nat Turner's Rebellion, that like people are coming for our slaves. Well, this isn't somebody actually going into the South and trying to foment rebellion. So for many Southerners, this is very much the last straw. They're like, the North is just a bunch of John Browns. Now, at the same time, just the same way that a bunch of Northerners disavowed William Lloyd Garrison's, radicalism in 1831, many people say, we're not a bunch of John Browns. We're not crazy. We're civil. Like, we can make this work, okay? Now, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is going to become the nominee. He's not like everyone's favorite. It takes many ballots for him in the 1860 convention right here in Chicago. He picks a guy named Hannibal Hamlin, who he'd never even met, from Maine. If you look there, the big idea is freedom for them, okay? It's free, free, free. You can see at the top, and the protection to American industry. That's talking about tariffs, okay? And of course, Abraham Lincoln has no beard. He doesn't actually have a beard until after he is elected. Now, the Republican Party platform is very much an homage to, the Federalists and the Whigs. It's BTN, like we saw, Hamilton had sort of a version of BTN. We know Henry Clay certainly did, but they're going to add farms and what they call free soil. So, the biggest part that we have to understand is this non-extension of slavery. And we get this. They're not abolitionists. I'm going to say it again. They're not abolitionists. I'm going to say it again. They're not abolitionists. Kids still don't get that. There might be some abolitionists in the party, but at the heart of their party, they're about no expansion of slavery into the territories. And that's really to try to attract, the old Free Soil Party. Protective tariffs, we've seen that. That's not surprising as the party of business. They're basically saying, like, we're not going to go after immigrants. Like, we're not going to be super harsh to immigrants. So if they were trying to attract know-nothings, that didn't really help. They're now talking about government aid to build a railroad. That certainly, follows along the, canals that we saw under Henry Clay, and then certainly, canals that we didn't get under Hamilton. Internal improvements, again, we certainly have seen that before. And free homesteads. They're not actually free, but it's basically saying, like, cheap farmland for people to go out west. So in many ways, it's got the old BTN, you add in the farms, and then you add in the free soil. But again, they're the party of business. They are, again, sort of party of farmers, but they're sort of not the dirtiest, dustiest farmers, and not like big plantation. They're sort of seeing them as sort of like the sturdy farmer, if you will, okay? Now, this is the election of 1860. That's Dred Scott right there in the middle. And up here, you've got Abraham Lincoln caricatured as dancing with a slave. So again, the Republicans are being lampooned or impugned for their relationship with slavery. You have Stephen Douglas dancing with a dirty Irishman. So the idea that the Northern Democrats were really tied in with the poor Irish in the cities. This is Breckinridge, who'd actually been the vice president to Old Buck, who looks like a goat, and sort of saying, well, he's tied into sort of the old Democratic ways. And then John Bell from the Constitutional Union Party is dancing with the Native American. I don't really understand. But what I want you to get here is that the Democrats split. The Democrats form basically two different rival factions. One, the Northern Democrats, Stephen Douglas, and then the Southern Democrats led by Breckinridge, who just can't stomach this idea of popular sovereignty. Like, they just don't get why the Democratic Party keeps standing behind it. So if you want, any evidence that, the country is coming apart, like, the Democratic Party is literally running two different candidates. And we saw, the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans in 1824 running four different candidates, but they still were all like sort of under one name. Like, this is like Northern Democrat, Southern Democrat, and then this, of course, random Constitutional Union Party. So in the end, we see these four candidates. 1824 was the last time we had four candidates. 1912, a really important election. We're going to see four candidates. And, even though you could add up Douglas's votes and John Bell's votes and Breckinridge's votes, they're still not going to beat Lincoln, because at the end of the day, there's just more population in the North, and that allows Lincoln to win, even though he's not even on the ballots in the South. Now, this is a famous image of Abraham Lincoln from 1860. It's called the rail splitter. And again, this is fence rails. And by the time Abraham Lincoln is, running for president, he's not this backwoods guy anymore. It's sort of like, saying Jackson is, this true common man when he's really like, a rich plantation owner. But this image was used to sort of sell Lincoln's image as this common man. And it also serves really well with the metaphor that I've been trying to show you guys from the beginning of this lecture, that if you looked at this stump, you've got, the North and the South together, but it's going to get split. And so Lincoln's election, it's sort of like he split that stump. Now, he didn't do it, but his election certainly did. So again, this is, interesting to look at. The purple is Lincoln, and that allows him to win. But it does really show that the Southern Democrat Breckinridge did, quite well throughout this sort of solid South, and shows that, Douglas just couldn't win states very well, but he did, at the end of the day, get the second most popular votes. Now, Lincoln is going to write to Alexander Stephens, who later becomes the vice president of the Confederacy, and he's trying to reassure the South. And he's like, listen, all right, I want you to understand, you guys are missing this. He says, do the people of the South really entertain fears that a Republican administration would directly or indirectly interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves? I want to assure you, as somebody who has been honest with you, I'm not an enemy. You should not be worried. He's trying to say, I don't know what you guys are thinking. You're not hearing us. All you're hearing is slaves, slaves, slaves. We're not coming after your slaves. We just don't want slavery in the territories. But the South won't hear it, in part because they keep projecting out. They're like, well, maybe that's not what you want right now, but certainly if the Republicans get more power, they're going to come after slavery, okay? Now, it's important to note that South Carolina's got swagger. We know that. Back in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, John C. Calhoun secretly was like, you know what? We'll nullify. And if you guys don't like it, we'll secede. And then they did nullify. They didn't secede because Henry Clay came to the rescue. But we're going to call this Sister Caroline. You'll see in a second. They go first. So after Lincoln is elected, they said, you know what? We told you that if the country elected a Republican, we're going to go. Okay, so they go. Okay, and the Confederate States of America is founded first in Alabama, then they're actually going to move up to Virginia, not very far from D.C., a few months later, with South Carolina, of course, as start, Mississippi, Alabama, not surprising, very, very high slave populations there, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas is going to join, and then we'll see four more come after Fort Sumter. But Lincoln is going to get inaugurated in March 1861. And it's really, really important that we sort of use that as an inflection point. But first, I want to share with you this poem. And I think it's a really interesting poem. And in many ways, it really reflects what Lincoln is going to try to say in his first inaugural address, a very famous inaugural address. So, Sister Caroline is South Carolina. Get it? SC, SC. She is gone. She has left us in passion and pride. Our stormy-browed sister, so long at our side. She has torn her own star from our firmament's glow and turned on her brother the face of the foe. Basically saying, South Carolina has always been that person that threatens they're going to do it. In this case, they did. Oh, Caroline, oh, child of the sun, we can never forget that our hearts have been won. Our foreheads both sprinkled in liberty's name from the fountain of blood with the finger of flame. We've always been in this together. Don't forget that. Again, we came together to fight against the British. We won. We came together to form a constitution. You were always so ready to fire at a touch, but we said she is hasty. She does not mean much. We have scowled when you have uttered some turbulent threat, but our friendship still whispered, forgive and forget. So we know how you are, South Carolina. We remember the nullification crisis, but in the end, we didn't actually think you'd really do this. Has our love all died out? Have its altars grown cold? Has the curse come at last, which our fathers foretold? Then nature must teach us the strength of the chain that her petulant child would sever in vain. Our union is river, lake, ocean, and sky. Man breaks not the metal when God cuts the die. Though darkened with sulfur, though cloven with steel, the blue arch will brighten, the waters will heal. Okay? Go then, our rash sister, afar and aloof, run wild in the sunshine away from our roof. But when your heart aches and your feet have grown sore, remember the pathway that leads to our door. So it's really not a message of vengeance, of threatening. It's saying, listen, we understand that you're upset, but we want to welcome you back whenever you want to come back. And in many ways, what this is basically saying is secession's not a thing. You can come away, but you can never really break the union. The union runs so deep, it's the river, lake, ocean, and sky. It's everything. So at the last ditch, to try to just maybe keep this country together, You've got John Crittenden. And again, I know that the Crittenden Compromise, the Lecompton Constitution, the Gadsden Purchase, and Wilmot Proviso, they all sound, hard to remember. But the Crittenden Compromise is pretty simple. It's basically like, okay, can we just like reestablish the Missouri Compromise line so that like any land below 3630 would be, slave territory, and anything above it would be free, just like it was before. It's sort of hard legally to figure out how that would be done, seeing as though Dred Scott basically said it couldn't be done. But at the end of the day, like it looks like it has a chance. But then Abraham Lincoln's like, no, like I'm not going to do it. What you don't understand is we don't want slavery in any territories, and this would allow it to be below 3630. So we're not going to go for it. So in many ways, Lincoln's election is what gets South Carolina and then other states to push away. If there is a chance for a compromise, Lincoln's not willing to go for it. So I'll skip this real fast. So Lincoln grows a beard. That's pretty interesting. Grace Bedell, writes him a letter. She's like a 10-year-old girl, I think, 11-year-old girl. And she's like, you got to grow a beard. It'll be great. So he actually goes in a beard. But he actually goes to Washington from Springfield, like sort of in disguise, because he's got to go through southern states on the rail line. And he's afraid that he might get assassinated. Okay. So Lincoln's first inaugural address is right up there with Washington's first inaugural, certainly with Jefferson's inaugural. And he wants to both take a strong stance, but also at the same time, make sure the South, who, again, like the Confederacy's been formed, but they don't have that many states yet. So he's really trying to keep states from going into the Confederacy. And more than anything, he's really trying to reassure what we call the border states. Those are northern states that do have slaves, but sort of are they have more sort of allegiance to the North. So he says, listen, you guys seem to be worried about your property, okay, like your slaves. Please, 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 they're not endangered, okay? I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists, just like he said to Stevens in that letter. He's like, I don't have a right to do so. I have no inclination to do so. He's basically saying, like, slavery is a state law, and I understand that, okay? But he also says, if the United States be not a government proper, but an association of states in the nature of a contract, then basically every person that came together in the contract, they all have to agree to release from that contract. So again, he's almost using like compact theory or contract theory to say, listen, if you guys want to sell it that way, that's fine. But you can't like unilaterally pull out of a contract. Everybody has to do it. And not everybody said it was okay. And he says, listen, I'm the president of the United States. I'm also the commander in chief, and I will occupy and possess the property and places belonging to the government. So he's saying, you know what? There's stuff that was already taken. It was federal property that's now in the South. He's like, I'm not going to go take it away from you. But everybody knows he's talking about Fort Sumter, which is a federal fort that is in Charleston Harbor that is not yet under Southern control. It's still under Northern control. And we'll get that in just a second. So again, he says in this speech, the Union is older than the Constitution. That's true. We know that. That's the whole idea of compact theory. So no state can leave it unless all states agree. Okay. I'm going to, slavery where it is, I'm not going to do anything about it, but slavery where it's not in the territories, I'm going to keep it out. And guys, I'm going to have to do something about Fort Sumter. Okay. There were some other properties too, but everyone knows he's talking about Sumter. Okay. Get to that in a second, though. So whereas Buchanan basically did nothing, he's like, listen, secession is illegal, but I don't believe I have the authority to stop anybody. Lincoln also says secession's illegal. He's like, physically, the states can't separate. Like, we're all contiguous, so you really can't leave. And he says secession is unlawful, again, going back to that compact idea. And then he says sort of, we got to understand sort of how governments work. If we allow secession, then it's a slippery slope to anarchy. So I'm going to do something to prevent it. Okay. And fundamentally, he sort of relies on that, like Sister Caroline, like we're enemies. No, we're not. We're friends. Like, come on. Like, we've been through so much together. And again, Ethan MJ Renda, this is the whole thing. Like, we have done so much to protect this democratic experience or Republican experiment, however you want to say it. It's like, we've been at this. We fought the British to really get this. We fought the British again to sustain it. We fought the Mexican-American War, not really to protect it, but to really just get more land. But like, why would we do this? This makes no sense. Like, we're exceptional. Why would we ever want to ruin that? So he's got some legal arguments, he's got some geographic arguments, he's got some philosophical arguments. And then you get yourself to South Carolina, okay? And this is Fort Sumter, a Southern song. So come now and gather around me, a story I'll relate. It happened near a city of South Carolina State. And now, old Uncle Abe, if you'll take some good advice, you'll ne'er invade our Southern soil. Think over the matter twice. So this is from the perspective of a Southerner. And before, Brother Jonathan's lament for Sister Caroline is from the north to the south. This is from the south to the north. There was in Charleston Harbor a fortress strong and great, commanded by Bob Anderson, which caused much debate. No relation to me. Now, Beauregard, and that's a Southern leader there, did loudly swear he would Fort Sumter take, and for to carry out his threat, did many batteries make. And now, old Uncle Abe, 'twas on a Friday morning, the day was wondrous fair, when soon a single gun was heard, loud booming through the air. Beauregard he pounded hard, while Sumter pounded back, till in 2 days this pounding, Fort Sumter's walls did crack. Then Anderson surrendered and marched his men away, and sailed with him to New York, where they'd better stay. So basically, we told you, Abe, you shouldn't have sent the ship to come down and give supplies. That's all they were doing. They weren't bringing weapons to Sumter. They were literally bringing them food to be able to survive. But Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy, again, the Confederacy is like 2 months old. He's like, we're not going to allow it. And you know what? It's too much to allow this fort to stay. So believe it or not, Beauregard and Robert Anderson, they knew each other. Southern leader out, on the shore, and Bob Anderson out there, like Fort Sumter out in the harbor. They knew each other. They corresponded. And it's basically like, we're going to shoot you. We're just telling you. No one died, but they certainly, shot at and destroyed Sumter. And in the process, they started the war. Okay. So that's the end of the slideshow. And again, I guess that's a great way to end with this dark screen. The country has gone dark. And again, after starting out in either 1607 at Jamestown, or 1620 at Plymouth, or 1630 at Mass Bay, you could sort of see this trajectory of a slave society in Chesapeake, starting in 1619 with the first Africans that are there, but really like 1676 at Bacon's Rebellion, and the anti-slavery that's going to really sort of develop in New England. And we find ourselves here in 1861 with a dark screen, and really the lowest moment in American history. So that was my lecture notes. I hope it's helpful to you guys as you develop your arguments for the most influential biennium. Throwdown, certainly, as you are going to prepare yourself for the essay on Thursday, which I'll tell you much more about upcoming, and then certainly for Friday's unit test. All right, folks. Cool. Bye.